And our guest today is Bart van Ark. He is the managing director of the Productivity Institute, and he's also a professor of productivity studies. The setup today is that Bart will give a presentation for 30 minutes or so. Then we open up for a discussion among the two of us. Having said this, Bart, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Danielle, and good afternoon, everyone. Real pleasure to join you. I think we've spoken probably 2-3 years ago, Danielle, can't quite remember.
Yeah.
But it's good to be here again, and my real pleasure to share some thoughts about recent work that we've been doing at the Productivity Institute, as well as some interesting insights from the work that we have been developing. So it's a real pleasure, and I'm really looking forward to hear your comments. You should be able to see my slides right now. So Daniel did ask me to speak about the Productivity Institute, and I said, oh, that's fine. I mean, that's what I do every day, so not a problem. But then I was thinking about it. I thought, well, how can I sort of excite you for 25 minutes or 30 minutes around what we do as an institute? So I thought I probably need to add some content to this as well. So I have a subline here. This is on pro-productivity policies and lessons learned and new beginnings. So I will, in fact, start with about 10 minutes about what we do and where we are currently in our process. I will then spend a couple of minutes as a transition into the second theme about some recent work that I've been doing around Europe-US comparisons, which is a very exciting topic for everyone. So I give you sort of my thoughts around it and will be interested in your comments. But then I really want to focus a little bit on recent work that we have been doing that I think is quite relevant for the work that you are all interested in at your institute, and I hope others as well, on the role of pro-productivity policies. We've done a lot of work around that, also in the international comparative perspective, and I really want to share some insights on that with you. So we got 3 things in one. I'll try to keep this all within 25, 30 minutes, and Daniel will stop me if I'm going over time in terms of all my enthusiasm. So what does the Productivity Institute do? Well, we've been around for about 6 years now. We started in 2020. It was a big grant that we received from the UK Research Institute. So that's the big sort of science foundation in the UK, the biggest grant actually in social sciences, to really sort of combine a lot of the work that was ongoing in the UK on productivity related issues under one umbrella. So the Productivity Institute is really a very large research center. We work with 8 other universities, 9 now actually, other universities in the UK. In total, we have about 80 co-investigators, probably about 200 researchers that have been involved with the work of the Productivity Institute over the years. And if people ask me what we do, I would basically say, well, we do pretty much everything under the sun related to productivity. I think that is our strength and our weakness. The strength is that we can make a lot of combinations of different things. The weakness, of course, is that there's a risk that even with a very large grant, we are at risk of spreading our sources too thinly. And therefore, as we are entering the second phase of the Productivity Institute by the beginning of next year, we are looking at a little bit more focus in the work that we're doing. But the principal part of what we are doing is around engagement. So we have, as you can see at the bottom of this little diagram, we have 8 research themes and 7 research programs. I will come back to that in a second. But I think the 2 other parts are really important as well. We have 8 regional productivity forums across the UK that include the 3 so-called devolved nations, Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, and then 5 major regions in England. And those are really forums that bring business leaders, regional policymakers and local policymakers, and the university in that region together to really put productivity issues in the context of what is happening on the region. I believe that productivity happens on the ground. That's where you see it. That's where you need to bring business and policy and expertise together. And that's what we're trying to do in these productivity forums. And then we also have a productivity commission. Actually, I should add to that now, we also have a policy unit doing research for that commission. That's not a statutory commission as we have in other European countries. It's linked to the Research Institute. It's completely independent. But we try to sort of fill a little bit of gap that the UK doesn't have a statutory productivity commission, and try to help give government advice and make suggestions on how they can develop a portfolio of effective pro-productivity policies. As I said, productivity is for us a little bit everything that's under the sun. That also means that we think very broadly around productivity. We take a deliberately very broad view. So we do have an economic perspective on this. We do a lot of work around the national statistics on labor productivity and total effective productivity and what this means across industries and across firms and distributions and everything else. But equally important, we spend a lot of time on what we call business productivity or strategic productivity, which is quite an important topic because, that productivity isn't necessarily a KPI, a key performance indicator for firms. So you really need to have a discussion with firms about what it really means in practice. How does it go beyond efficiency, which is sort of doing more with less? How do we actually build it out to this broader concept? And then at the top, very importantly, there's a place-based concept. As I said, productivity happens on the ground. So you need to really have this sort of place-based perspective on it. So we define productivity as being how we optimally combine and use resources to create better outcomes for people, firms, and the economy. And yes, efficiency is part of that, and some of the economic concepts are part of that, but obviously both on the inputs, on the resources, and on the outputs and the outcome side, the concept is broader, and we deliberately sort of push beyond the traditional inputs and the traditional outcomes. And we can talk a little bit more about this. I mentioned earlier that we started with 8 research themes. Actually, in the end, there were 9 because we added sectors to that as well. We tried to cover a lot of critical research issues, but then in the last 2-3 years, we have translated that in the rows to 7 research programs that are a little bit more focused on issues directly focused on people and the role of firms, and then the role of sort of the economy and institutions and places in the productivity story. We're now actually at the time of delivering that. I'll show you in a minute that we, in our next National Productivity Week, end of April, all the work that's been done over the last few years is now coming together and being summarized in one hopefully compelling narrative with important implications for policies going forward. As I said, we do a lot around policy. So right from the beginning, we have been producing fairly accessible kind of documentation. You can see it on the screen. You can also see it for free just behind me. Those are our key policy documents, our productivity agenda, which was a national focus that we put out in 2023. And then just last year, we put out a more regional productivity agenda. So that was much more focused on the regional and the local governments. And then last year, we also put out a document around joining up pro-productivity policies. I'll come back to that in the second half of my talk, because we really think there's so many aspects to pro-productivity policies that the secret sauce is really how do we optimally join up or combine these different types of policies. And we try to make a start with that in this document, but as said, I'll come back to that a little later. And then finally, we do a lot of data work. I think we all believe that we can only get our arms around this topic if we have good data. We have reasonably good data at a macro level, although even there we can debate issues around measurement, certainly with new technologies and how these are impacting on productivity. But in addition to that, we think we need to have much more granular metrics around regional metrics, around metrics that are more useful for sector and industry. And we also take on the right-hand side a broad capital approach, again, speaking to the fact that we think broadly around productivity. So this is not just physical capital and human capital, but also other intangibles, but also social capital and institutional capital and natural capital. So we think broadly around these concepts of inputs and resources as well as outputs. And it all comes together in our productivity laboratory. You can see a QR code there. Those slides can be shared, by the way, with you afterwards, and feel free to dig a little bit through our website, where there's a lot of this material that you may find useful and inspiring for some of the work that you may be working on or be interested in yourself. This is just one example of place-based scorecards. These are metro areas in the UK. We call them mayoral combined authorities. And we really try to rank these authorities, not just on the performance of productivity, but also on some of the key drivers, key business drivers, such as export intensity and the formation of new businesses, but also skills and training and health and well-being metrics and investment in infrastructure and connectivity metrics. And what this chart does, it's a kind of heat map. It sort of compares the performance of each of those combined authorities relative to the UK average, and see where regions have the strengths and weaknesses. We find a surprisingly strong engagement with these kind of scoreboards. I mean, there are perhaps academically not the most, you don't win the Nobel Prize with this kind of stuff, but it is very helpful for regional and local policymakers to really start a discussion about the strengths and weaknesses of the region and how these different aspects of productivity drivers all come together. And again, that feeds a little bit into the second story on pro-productivity policies that I'll talk about in a minute. As I said, we do have an annual large engagement event. We call this National Productivity Week, our third one. It's going to be end of April. And this is really focused on trying to bring the topic of productivity to a broader audience. Obviously, productivity isn't this kind of popular concept that everybody wants to talk about, but we think the narrative around productivity really comes to life if we show how important this topic is related to various things that are happening in the business community as well as in the policy community. So this year, as I said earlier, a lot of it is going to be focused on our 7 research programs. We have a big event in Manchester on 27 April where that will be showcased. But we'll also do some work around our strategic productivity work with businesses. We have a daily webinar during that week. All our productivity forums will have events during that week, and we partner with other organizations as well. So it's really also a way we invite other organizations around the country to do activities around productivity during that National Productivity Week. Let me skip this and just move on to the next item. So that's a little bit sort of the setting of the Productivity Institute. And again, even though that was the key area of the title, I'm happy to discuss that a little bit more during the Q&A. But I wanted to give you a bit of a flavor of some work that I think is quite relevant for other countries in terms of how to think about pro-productivity policies. And a good point to start, and I'll be very brief on that, is to actually look a little bit at the comparative picture of the sort of economic productivity measures. So I'm going to be much more narrow now and just focus on these metrics of labor productivity. This is the latest numbers from the Conference Board, my previous employer, where we developed this total economy database, which has a lot of metrics around productivity. This is just a level of labor productivity, purchasing power parity converted in 2024 dollars. And we can see a couple of stories that I think we're familiar with, but they come out clearly in the data. Well, one is that the US has indeed moved ahead of pretty much all other major countries in the world in recent years. The last 3-4 years, you can see decisive acceleration in US productivity growth. So a lot of debate around this. Some of it is related, of course, to the big stimulus that was given under the Biden government. But we think there's probably an element as well as new technologies that are beginning to have some impact, at least on the tech sectors that are relatively large as a share of the total economy in the US. And there is some evidence. You may have seen a piece by Eric Ben-Jolson, op-ed in the Financial Times just yesterday, basically arguing that I think we're beginning to see these AI effects in the data in the case of the US, although again, probably highly concentrated in a limited number of tech-related sectors. Then there are a couple of European countries that are sort of behind the US, but not dramatically. This includes Sweden, but also Germany, the Netherlands are there. France was there, but has really lost some ground. That's the green line there. But roughly you talk about a $7 to $10 per hour difference in 2024 dollars in terms of labor productivity performance. That is substantial. It's not dramatic. We've seen that before. Even if you go back in this chart to 2005, inflation corrected, you would see similar or even larger numbers. So I wouldn't panic around this. But I think the other part of the story is that it's very much a multi-speed Europe. If you look at the euro area average, which is the thick blue line, a little bit further down, and you also see Spain and Italy there. Also, the UK is very close to that. You can see there's a multi-speed Europe of some countries that are $20 or even more behind the United States. And that, of course, is a substantial level. So I think that multi-speed Europe has always been there. But I think, again, in recent years, we're beginning to see some of that increase in different performances. And that, of course, has implications for the policy agenda in Europe on how to continue that. And I'll come back to that a little later. 2 points I really want to make here. One is, yes, productivity growth matters. It obviously is critical. I don't have to convince this audience, otherwise you wouldn't have been on this call. It is important for innovation, for structural change, and for stronger competitiveness. That's the story that everybody tells, and we wouldn't disagree with that. But we also believe that productivity levels matter because high productivity levels do support the resilience of an economy to absorb shocks, to limit the risk of low performance traps as well, because we are always looking at country averages here. And that means there are quite a few geographies, regions, that will be below these averages. This is very notable in the UK, for example, where the average is about $80. But we do have regions in the UK where it's probably around $50. And then you get to a point of productivity that it doesn't really support per capita income and living standards in a sustained way in these regions. And these regions then fall into a low performance trap. And the problem of low performance traps is that policies become much more harder to make effective because they require systemic changes, and that will take significantly longer time before they're sorting effects. So it means that any kind of policy measure you take to support productivity will only increase the inequality, because the regions that are already doing well, the firms that are already doing well in those regions are moving ahead of everyone else. And that's a clear concern that we have to worry about right now, which again, I'll come back to in the second half of my talk. Now, I think we are making a mistake in Europe if we keep always our eye on the US. There are lots of reasons, also non-economic reasons not to do that, but certainly from a productivity perspective, we really have to understand that the dynamics of productivity growth in the US are quite different than in Europe. You can see that here, for example, the blue dots here for two subperiods show you the growth of productivity before the financial crisis and then the growth of productivity after the financial crisis. Yes, that was higher in the US in both periods, but it has come down big way in the US as well. And also in the earlier period, as you can see on the right-hand side, almost all of the growth in US productivity was driven by an acceleration in output and basically no creation of further jobs. There was a huge amount of hollowing out, and a lot of the social and political problems that we're seeing in the US right now are related to the fact that over that period in the early 2000s, we actually created very, very few jobs in the case of the United States. That has changed after 2010. You can see that the job creation has become much better in the US, better actually than it was in Europe. Europe is a much more stable picture. It's slower, but the dynamics of productivity growth haven't changed as dramatically as they have changed in the US. Now, this is even more visible, of course, in manufacturing, where, of course, offshoring has been driving this destruction of jobs, which is the green bars that you're seeing here in the US dramatically. That also happened in Europe, but to a much lesser extent than was the case in the United States. So it's a very different kind of story. And it's a story that I think many European countries and European policymakers and European citizens wouldn't have appetite to repeat the way this was done in the case of the US. And the price we are perhaps paying is a slower productivity growth. Also, it turns out that if you take a sectoral breakdown, you can really see that US productivity has been very strongly driven by digital producing sectors. That's the red bars of these bars. They contributed this, it's a relatively small part of the economy and therefore contribute disproportionately much to aggregate productivity growth. And a lot of that has been translated into market services, professional business services, financial services, which is the green bit here, that are doing well. Difference in manufacturing productivity don't really matter all that much. So all that focus that we have on the strength of manufacturing, that's not where the story is. The story really is in the digital sector of the economy, many of that being services these days and not manufacturing, and the opportunities that it has created, particularly in the market services sector of the economy. And then the last slide to wrap this middle section up really relates to what are the key drivers here of growth. So what you see here is a growth accounting exercise. This just looks at the period 2011 to 2021. This could be extended a little bit with recent data that are now appearing, but it won't change the fundamental story. So first of all, it's very striking to see that the light gray part, which is the contribution of labor composition, this is essentially educational attainment levels to productivity growth, has actually been higher in the EU than in the US. We have no shortage of human capital. Well, we may have mismatches and issues like that, but at the aggregate, we actually create a lot of human capital in the case of Europe, and it contributes significantly to labor productivity growth. Where we do see large differences is to some extent, of course, in IT capital deepening. So the digital capital deepening, that's the red bit, the light red bit, that is bigger in the US than it is in the EU. But the large differences arise from two other parts, which is intangible capital and total factor productivity. So intangible capital, there are two parts to that. One is intangible capital that is already measured in our national accounts. So this is research and development and databases and software. But then there's also a light green part, which is the stuff that's not yet in the national accounts, but has to do with organizational capital and other economic competencies. that firms are having. And again, in both cases, you see larger contributions of that intangible capital in the case of the US than in Europe. And that then all translates into a residual, the total effective productivity growth that is just significantly larger in the US than it is in the case of Europe. So a couple of key lessons here. The things that we can learn from the US are, first of all, that the US really has dominated this sort of upstream AI-related recently digital software production. So we call this these days an invention in the method of invention. If you are very active in that upstream part of your economy, you really have a significant advantage because you're driving a lot of the research, you create a lot of the intangibles that are used elsewhere in the economy to create faster productivity growth. So the second bullet point does exactly confirm that, and that is that the US market services have benefited hugely from that active digital AI role. So you see science-related industries, professional business services really driving a lot of the productivity growth in the US. We also find that US growth does complement intangibles and total effective productivity growth, and there's a lot of evidence suggesting that new business formation and worker reallocation is doing better in the case of the US than in Europe. So we shouldn't be blind to the success of the United States. There are definitely areas where we can learn and where we have a lot of work to do in Europe to make sure that we develop an economy that is sort of higher up into the value chain in terms of creating more science and technology-driven industries, and to make sure that that translates itself into the creation of these intangibles in the economy. But there are other reasons why the US is not a good comparison. The offshoring approach that has been chosen in the US during the 1990s and 2000s is not something that's to be repeated in Europe. We have seen the consequences of that, not just economically, but also socially and potentially even politically. So that's a path not to follow. We do see a lot of firm concentration in the US. So yes, we have a lot of new business formation at the lower end of the value chain, but we have a lot of concentration high up in the value chain, particularly in the digital sector. And that, of course, is reducing potential competitive opportunities downstream. Beyond digital market services, AI adoption rates are actually relatively weak in the case of the US, and definitely not faster than Europe. If you look at the AI adoption numbers for the economy as a whole, produced by the Census Bureau in the US, they're not really significantly faster than the numbers that we have for Europe. So again, it's highly concentrated just in that sort of digital market services area. And then, of course, we have to realize that the US productivity figures include a number of what you might call bads. If you take the output as a broader concept, as I talked earlier, you take, for example, environmental impacts on board, that, of course, you would get adjusted numbers where Europe would feature less of a gap relative to the US than it does on the official numbers. So I think, and this is the transition to my last section, I think the US just tells us that we have to be careful with comparing two country models, whether it's the US or any other country, but that we really need to look at sort of context-specific experiences and time-bound episodes which we can learn from. And that really gets me to my last section, a lot of work that we currently been doing around what we call productivity policies or pro-productivity policies, and how to think around these kind of pro-productivity policies. I've been doing this work together with my colleague Dirk Pilat, who used to be Deputy Director, STI at the OECD, is now retired and joined our institute, and we started to work on this. How do we really need to think about productivity policies? We don't have a productivity department. Yes, some countries may have ministries where there is a team that is working on productivity, but we find out quickly enough that this is touching on a lot of policies that are across government, related, of course, partly to economic issues like investment and finance, but also to skills creation, education, to technology innovation, to international trade and foreign direct investment, and to a lot of underlying institutions. So in this chart, and we've written a whole paper around this, we sort of try to identify these various areas of policies, basically come down to two areas of what we call direct drivers. This is basically accumulation of production factors, so investment and human capital, which is on the left-hand side here. On the right-hand side, you've got sort of technology and structural change. Industrial policy is an element of that, which I'll say something about just in the next slide. And then you have some indirect policies, which have to do with market performance, with competition, with regulation, with product market and labor market performances, and also with the trade environment and trade policy, and perhaps even migration policies linked to that as well. Underlying this are critical foundational policies. And that's perhaps a major reason why we can't look at these direct and indirect drivers in isolation of what the institutional setup of a country is. So how does the institutional framework work in these countries? And I'll give you a few examples in a second. Also, the capabilities of government to drive a complex policy domain like productivity. And also macroeconomic policy can play a significant role and has a very long path dependency in many of these countries. So these foundations are of critical importance. Now, before I dive a little bit into results, it's perhaps good, and I'll be a little bit more specific and like to have your comments about this, to not mix up industrial strategy, industrial policy with pro-productivity policies. They're strongly related, but in our view, they're not the same. And it's useful, certainly from an intellectual point of view, and perhaps also from an implementation point of view, to clearly make the distinction. Industrial strategy is, I always say, about choices. It's about changing the structure of the economy, and it means that therefore we have to let some things go and some things come. And that means choices in terms of sectors and industries or clusters. We can name it whatever you want it, but not everything can be done. It is a choice between the role of market versus the role of government. It's a choice between protectionist type of activity to protect what you have or creating resilience so that you're stronger for the future. It is a choice between putting the emphasis on the frontier or on the catch-up. It's a choice between doing more stuff at an EU-wide level where we have more scale versus what we do at national or regional level where we have much more a link to what is happening on the ground. And it's a choice between stability and risk. So it's always around choices. Pro-productivity policies are much more focused on what I would call the horizontal capabilities. It's not about choices. It's about to strengthen the access to the sources of productivity growth, to join them up, and to improve participation across the economy, whether it is people or firms or places in the productivity process, and to also think about how can we work towards a broader distribution of the benefits so that we create this positive loop. So the two things are really important. The things really need to connect and talk to each other, but they're not the same. And I think that is important to keep in mind when we think more deeply around these pro-productivity policies. 5 more minutes, Danielle, if that's okay. We've commissioned 17 case studies after we did this first paper for a wide range of countries. Many of them OECD countries, but it also includes India and China and a couple of countries, Brazil, Chile. So it's a wide range of G20 type economies. They're not all in the G20, but many of them are. And we've asked these authors, who are all experts in this field, to actually give an account of the history of pro-productivity policies over the last, say, 4 or 5 decades, recognizing the sort of long-term path dependency of these policies, and then give some suggestions about what this means in going forward. And as I said, what I said earlier comes out of these studies very clearly. There's no unique country model. All the countries have seen periods of success and periods of failure. Starting points matter. The structure of the economy matters. There are large differences in the consistency and the scope and the intensity of these policy reforms. But we do see critical elements of all successful pro-productivity policies, which quite often mean coherence and policy coordination taking place across these different policy domains. So that's a kind of overall sort of insight that we got straight away from these studies. Now, I don't have the time to go through these individual factors, but some of the observations here around public investment, around the much more nuanced view on human capital, not just thinking about tertiary education, but much more about technical and vocational education apprenticeships, shine through in many of these studies. A big portfolio of diverse innovation-related policies with varying success. Industrial policies that I talked about, where frankly most of the studies show more failures than successes on industrial policies. It is a critical element, as I said, we need to talk to it. But most of the evidence of historical experience on industrial policy are not very good. So we really need to think hard about what that is going to mean in going forward. Obviously, a lot of stuff around regulatory reforms and what is exactly needed, what is good regulation, what is not so good regulation, and a lot of thinking about the labor markets and how different elements of labor market policy can have positive or mixed effects on productivity growth. I'm just skipping through those slides very quickly, except for this last one, because this last one goes back to my point of the importance of institutions and frameworks. We do find that there's a lot of institutional inertia. Institutions don't change very easily. And when they start to change, they quite often tend to begin to show some fragilities. And we find quite a few countries that found it difficult to change productivity policies because of the underlying institutional weaknesses that we're having. Even in advanced countries like Italy, for example, it has struggled for that for a long time. And we have examples. I don't want to single out Italy here. We have examples in other countries as well. We have low government capabilities in quite a few areas, particularly if you go down to the regional and the local level. The capabilities of government to actually implement these policies can be quite substantial. And then finally, macroeconomic stability matters enormously, and it has really enabled pro-productivity policies very clearly visible in Ireland, also in Brazil, also in Korea, and even in Italy. We have seen that some of these reforms that have been taking place slowly have been the result of more stable policies. 5 key findings, and then I will wrap up. First of all, it is probably true that policy action in productivity is harder than it was before. And that's mostly related to the fact that most of the countries that we're looking at and that add most to global GDP are close to the productivity frontier. So there was a lot of catching up going on still in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, even in the 2000s. But I think we now get a lot of countries close to the frontier, or they are sort of at that middle income level and sort of struggle to get out of that middle income level to the high income level. But easy wins like free trade or universal education, sending everybody to university, or big regulatory reforms or typical catch-up growth is not there anymore. And therefore, policy coordination and coherence of different policy domains is much more challenging now. So you could say the low-hanging fruit has been picked, and the high-hanging fruit is much higher, much more difficult to pick than was the case in the past. Secondly, there are headwinds to productivity growth. Aging populations, slowdown in globalization that we've been seeing, which has been happening already for more than a decade, so that's not a new story. And also, certainly more recently, wavering policies with regard to net zero and climate change. Also all countries have gone down that road. There's now sort of a lot of backtracking on this because we're sort of going through this valley of death in terms of the impacts of those kind of policies on growth, and the costs are higher than the benefits for the time being, and therefore you get wavering policies here. There are big political economy challenges, and this goes back to the fundamentals. High concentration effects among firms create lots of vested interest. We also see that the kind of new technology that we're seeing make that intangibles get more owned by companies, so the non-rivalry of intangibles has gone away. So power dynamics and vested interest of incumbents are combined with pretty weak competition policy in many countries, and this is a key area to do more work on. Having said that, all countries want to improve productivity. There is a large unfinished agenda in many countries. One is public investment that many countries are now beginning to focus on and have been falling behind for a significant time, impacting on public sector productivity. Industrial strategy, which I talked about before, is a critical element to productivity growth. But again, as I said, quite different from the kind of pro-productivity policies we're talking about. There's a big story around innovation and technology diffusion. And we need much more refined approaches to human capital. So there's a lot of work that's being done around competition, but a critical element is the lack of political will that needs to be overcome, because we're talking about small improvements in productivity where the benefits are not necessarily being seen immediately. So you put in a lot of political capital for relatively limited effects over time. But as productivity is a compounding variable, after 10 years, as we just saw in the multi-speed levels of productivity over years, it can go and make a very, very significant difference. So finding this willingness to put in political capital to get these kind of longer term gains is really, really challenging. And then finally, we really need a better narrative around productivity. I mentioned this earlier when I talked about the work we do at the Productivity Institute. It's not an easy story to tell. Productivity quite often is felt by a lot of people as meaning budget cuts, as meaning loss of jobs, certainly in those era of AI, where we think it's all about automation. So we need to just talk not about the growth rate, which is important, but also about the pattern of growth. Who has access to these kind of resource of productivity growth, and who's going to benefit from that? And we think that also requires addressing regional gaps in SME performance. Let me stop here. There are a few more slides there at the end, Danielle, but I think I've said enough, and I want to make sure that I want to leave some time for questions. And as I said, I'm always happy to send the slides to every one of you and have a further discussion.
Many thanks for this, Bart. A very clear and informative presentation. I have a lot of questions, some prepared from before and some from your presentation. And I start immediately, if I may. And the first is the question about Brynjolfsson, as you said in Financial Times yesterday. Do you agree with him? Can you see the first real patterns of effects in these parts of the economy?
Sorry, I was still muted. I think it's still hard to say, Danielle, because so what Nielsen is arguing is saying in 2025 we've now seen a 2.7% productivity growth.
Yeah.
And he assigns that to AI without being too specific about where is this happening in the economy and what other effect may be playing a role. As I said, there's been a massive stimulus under Biden, and that is still feeding its way through the economy. It's not that when Trump came in that whole stimulus was kind of withdrawn. I mean, major companies, regions, states in the US benefit from that. So I think there's a big element of that.
Yeah.
AI effects are visible in the data, but they're highly concentrated in a limited number of sectors, and I haven't seen the evidence yet that this is spreading very widely across the economy. I think the most important point that Brynjolfsson is making, and that's what I agree with, AI is going to have productivity effects. The question is, how long will it take? How big will these effects going to be? And who's going to benefit from that most? And certainly there's no reason for us to sit back and don't think there's anything happening there. But I don't think we should exaggerate it. So I don't think I have evidence yet that this general purpose technology is going to give us significantly bigger productivity gains than what we've been seeing previously.
Okay, thanks. I will continue with the weak productivity performance in the UK. I mean, it has been pretty flat since the financial crisis. Is there any agreement on why this has happened in the UK, or is it still a debate about it?
Sorry, can you ask the question again? I was distracted a little bit. Sorry about
that. The weak productivity growth in the UK.
Yeah.
Is there nowadays a consensus on what the reasons behind it is, or what do people say? Or
I think at a high level there is consensus, and that consensus is that we've seen a sustained, and actually this blue book at the background, National Productivity Agenda, 3 years ago we made that point, and I think we got generally agreement on that. Long-term, broad-based underinvestment in the UK economy, which goes back decades, really. I mean, this is not the Conservative government, it goes even further back than that. Yeah. And if you underinvest, particularly in the public area for a very long time, you get significant effects. Secondly, the UK doesn't have very strong diffusion institutions of technology. So it doesn't have really the right setup to make sure that technology diffuses. We have great universities, but we still don't have very good ways of getting that technology and that innovation to the economy. Yeah. And thirdly, the UK really struggles from a government's perspective with a highly centralized government in Westminster. Then powers have been devolved to the three devolved nations. But in England, local authorities, I made this point about government capabilities being very important at the local level. And that's still very weak. Of those combined authorities that I showed you in that traffic light chart with green, red, and orange, yeah. I would say there are probably only 2 regions that I would say are quite powerful. 3, actually. One is, of course, Greater London. Yeah. Then there's Greater Manchester, where I'm based, and there's the West Midlands. And I think most of the other metropolitan areas combined authorities still struggle a lot with government capabilities, and that's a third big issue.
Okay, but the diffusion aspect you mentioned, has this been weakened lately, so you can explain the reduction in?
No, actually, it's quite interesting when people ask me, you know, what sort of made me interested in working on this topic in the UK setting, because actually in my whole career, this is the first time I've worked for 5 years on a specific, 6 years on a specific country. Okay. And I've always said there are kind of 3 reasons. One is there's a huge amount of brain power in the UK. We've got great universities, lots of people working on this stuff. So it was fantastic to engage with them. Secondly, pretty much everything that can go wrong with productivity in the UK has gone wrong. So it's not the only country that has a problem, but somehow everything went wrong, and some of it is self-inflicted wounds, as we all know. But then thirdly, which comes to your question, something I hadn't realized, there is a lot of activity going on. So there's a lot of organizations that try to work on diffusion and so on, but it is very fragmented. And you, even in diffusion institutions, you need scale. And many of the smaller economies, including Sweden, but also the Netherlands, have succeeded to build these kind of institutional structures around diffusion. Germany has been very successful with it through the Fraunhofer Institute and other institutions. I think the UK has really struggled with building that sort of institutional framework about the diffusion mechanism. Firms, if you ask firms where to go for new technologies, most of them would say we don't really know. Not because it's not there, it's just too small and too fragmented.
Okay. Just continue a bit on the UK here. I saw some positive figures on the UK productivity also a few days ago. Strong growth last year, but double or triple from the couple years ahead of that, or?
Yes, there has been some positive growth, partly because investment trends have gone up. I mean, like other countries, the UK is also responding to new technology opportunities. So we do see some increase in labor productivity. The increase in total effective productivity is still very, very low. The public sector investment is still very far behind. And we have to realize we're coming from real low levels. So, you know, a growth rate can already look pretty substantive if you come from relative.
We're catching up.
Yeah, so you could say the UK in a way is catching up a little bit, or I would probably express this differently. It's recovering from self-inflicted wounds.
Okay. But we had Diane Coyle here, your colleague, as participated in a webinar here, and she's a strong propagator of the investment discussion on your book and so forth. But do you agree that the lack of investment in Europe also means that we have to, like Aguillon says, invest despite our high debt to GDP ratios? Because that is the source where we can generate growth.
So first of all, I think we've got, I mean, this is a bit technical and sorry for the non-economists on this call, but I think, you know, a lot of this growth accounting that we do, and I showed you this one chart with the contributions of human capital and physical capital to labor productivity growth, is based on a sort of exogenous way of thinking around the role of TFP and investment, right? So you basically sort of decompose these things and you think all these things are kind of separate. And then, of course, you do see that total effective productivity has fallen, but then investment has fallen a big way. Total effective productivity we find difficult to change, but investment we think we can ramp up. Now, some people, Bart van Ark is a good example of this, have made the point and say, well, be very careful. If you go back to Solo, you know, you got to really think about your steady state, right? And the steady state is, of course, endogenously determined by the state of technology, right? So if you have a low technology state, you have a low level of total effective productivity growth, then you can invest like hell, but it's not going to make a difference because you're going to invest in all sorts of stuff that doesn't give you the total effective productivity effects. So if you control for sort of steady state capital output ratios, as Vernalt is doing, then actually the problem is not in investment. The problem is on TFP. The problem is on a lot of issues with the state of technology itself, but also with all these indirect factors that I was talking about, the state of markets, the performance of our product markets, and our institutional framework and all those kind of things. So my viewpoint, again, apologies for the non-economists on the call, but my viewpoint, the consequence of that is that we should be careful to say, because we don't know how to deal with total effective productivity, we just think if we just throw more and more money at it, it will be fine. Well, we'll get some labor productivity growth. In the US, we get a lot of labor productivity growth, but the total effective productivity growth has to come from the much more complex gains in terms of combining these resources to get better outcome. That's the only long-term driver of economic growth in the longer term. So I think we've got to be careful in Europe and say, it's not just about sort of, 800 billion, that Draghi wants to put into the European economy. And there's a lot more investment needed, but be careful where you invest it, because ultimately we need to have our markets work better, our institutions work better, our government playing a different role in allocating those resources, having supplementary investment in the public sector of the economy and so on. So it's a bit more complex than that.
Okay. Just a little bit follow up on that. There's a discussion in Europe, of course, after the financial crisis and the euro crisis, that the zero interest rates and the austerity made the demand level too low for a long time, and the firms didn't have incentive to increase productivity because they had this cheap money. Are you also reluctant on that part too, or do you think that is a part of the story?
No, I have some sympathy for it. It's clear that we didn't end up in the secular stagnation kind of era that we were worried about, say, 10 years ago.
Yeah.
I did for some time think that probably people like Larry Summers and so on might have something there. But it's definitely true that we have huge supply constraints in the economy, and productivity automatically sort of goes to the supply side because it kind of delivers that we can pull, right? But the reason why I put macroeconomic policy in our policy framework and make a big point in all our studies that macroeconomic policy matters has to do with demand. If the demand is not there, there's no point in doing anything about your supply side areas of the economy. So macroeconomic growth and making sure that there is sufficient demand out there in the economy does matter a lot. And that also means that sometimes you may have to increase your debt to GDP a little bit more than perhaps you would want to. And it's an interesting question in current times where we want to massively invest in things like defense and so on. The question is, what kind of defense? And are we then going to do that at the cost of other expenses in order to keep our debt low? Or are we willing to actually let our debt increase a little bit? Different stories between countries. If you talk about multi-speed Europe, it's perhaps not a surprise that the countries that are actually doing relatively well are countries that have relatively good debt to GDP ratios, whereas the ones, France being one example, where you've seen debt to GDP ramp up, are really beginning to suffer now.
Okay. When we come to the manufacturing sector, we have this old Verdun law or Kaldor's law that strong demand in manufacturing output also push productivity growth up. Are you a believer in that? Have you done any research within the institute on that?
On your last question, I don't think we've done a lot on it in recent years. It's a story that has been around for a long time, and I mean, to my earlier comment, size matters, and so the role of the growth on output on the sector and the demand in the sector does play a role, and it's all the more a reason to make sure that we scale things up in a way that I think the biggest scaling opportunity, maybe go back also a little bit to your previous question. The biggest scaling opportunity for Europe is on the demand side. A lot of the supply side issues we can resolve at the national level. That's where pro-productivity policies come in.
Yeah.
But I think at the demand side, we need scale. And that's perhaps where industrial policy comes in, which is I want to push that difference between pro-productivity policy and industrial policy even a little further and say industrial policy, I would primarily leave at the European level. Not that we're not involved as member states, but I think this is a European exercise. The supply side are issues we need to resolve at the member state level.
Oh, okay. Thanks. Then I shift a little bit of perspective here. You have this policy unit and you have a strong, the government in the UK, the Starmer is going for the growth strategy and so forth. But when you talk about the inclusive productivity growth, what do you actually mean by that in terms of policy?
With a couple of elements to this. If you think about people, firms, and places, inclusivity comes in all those areas. So in people, this is a big problem in the UK, although it's a problem in other countries too. But we have seen since the pandemic, the level of inactivity in the economy not improve. It has improved somewhat, but we're still in the UK not back to pre-pandemic levels. In most European countries, we are now. Yeah. But we've really struggled for a long time getting enough people back into the labor force. And a lot of that has to do with the comment I made early on around low productivity traps. Yeah. Because if people are living in areas and in regions and in places where productivity is very low, it becomes very hard for them to get back into the labor market. So you see these big pockets of concentration of inactive people who, just by giving them a little bit of training, is not bringing them back into the labor market. There's well-being and health issues that probably need to address before that. So that is one reason where we think a lot of public investment has to go. That's why we do a lot of work on health and well-being. Yeah. Not because we think it's a nice thing to have, it's a need to have in order to increase economic activity in the economy. On firms, the issue is that certainly under the influence of new technologies and AI, there is high concentration effects in larger firms. Smaller firms really struggle with this. They can get some of the low-hanging fruit from AI, but they're not going to benefit from the more substantive impacts on long-term productivity growth unless they can be helped to change their business model. So inclusivity is also about improving access for these firms to these new technology and help them to implement them in the organization. And then finally, this all comes back to places. We do a lot of our inclusive productivity work in places where we try to work with individual local authorities around questions about this broad capital concept. This is not just about investment in factories and in roads and in infrastructure, but it's also investment in people and in the community in order to create an environment where people want to live and work, where firms want to invest, and where people even have a certain level of pride, because that does matter in order to make a place a better place to work and live.
Yeah, I'm glad you say that, because our next webinar is with George Ward, who has written the book Why Workplace Wellbeing Matters, where with rigorous data can causally see that firms with a better health work environments are more productive, more profitable. So it's not only a matter of being nice. It's a hard fact about reality.
I think so. Yeah. But it's so hard to do. So that's why we have a role to play.
Yeah, and they published this book a year ago, and it has got quite a good reputation, I would say. And also, the webinar after that is with Pashta Dasgupta, who is working on natural capital.
Yeah.
So he's also broadened the perspective, as you do, not only human capital and physical capital and so forth. But does it mean that you want to adjust the productivity figure we aim for as a society because of all these complexities?
Well, that's a really good question. And a debate that we're also having internally. So I'll give you my view, which is not necessarily the view of everyone in the TPI.
Yeah.
I think there are sort of three groups here. The first group is basically saying we need to get away from this concept of GDP. Well, actually, there's another group that says we need to get away from GDP at all. It's the degrowth group. So let me not talk about the degrowth group. We can spend another discussion around that. But let's start with the group that says if we're working on a concept of national output and growth, we need to broaden that concept to other welfare measures. And there's a group in the institute that says we just need to adjust our output concept for environmental damage. So we need to develop a green GDP concept, essentially.
Yeah.
We can do that. It will take a long time. I think I'm very in favor of that research. We actually supported some of that research. It's interesting, but I still don't quite see how that is going to be a metric that will be very widely adopted globally and that will really help us to drive forward. The second part is where I'm a little bit more warming up for, is to think about what are the key resources going into the production process. So that's why I do like to think about this broader concept of capital. That's why I do like to think about natural capital as something you invest in that generates a return, that has a long-term longevity, that goes beyond the annual expense kind of nature as we have it in our accounts. And their thinking around natural capital is quite important. Certainly, how do you build natural capital as a community? And Dasgupta obviously has a lot of things to say about that kind of thing. So you're really building up to stronger and stronger people on your seminar series. So congratulations on that.
No, I don't think so, but yeah.
And then there's the first stream where I probably play my biggest role, and that I say it's a way of thinking, because, and that sounds a little bit soft, but productivity is about how we transform our resources into better outcomes and better results. It's a transformation process.
Yeah.
And it is in that transformation process that you can be much more inclusive, that you can be much more sustainable in what you do. So from a business perspective, you would say this is about ESG. From a national perspective, it would be about the UN sustainability goals. But to me, it's all about behavior of policymakers, of entrepreneurs, and of people on how we are transforming these resources into better outcomes. So those three streams are not exclusive. One is about measurement of output. The other one is how do we think about our inputs? And the other one is how do we think about the transformation process as it happens?
Yeah.
And I warm up at the moment, I warm up most to the last. That's where I see my role, without necessarily saying that these other things are not necessary.
Okay. Very good answer. Just we have 4 minutes left. One topic you mentioned was weak competition policy. Why is that? Where can you see that? Is it related to the AI giants, or where is it?
Yeah, I think in most countries, our competition policy is not up anymore to the way that technologies and concentration of resources are working. So competition policy is very much now about the leveling playing field, takes that as a starting point.
Yeah.
Whereas in a way, the technology itself is anti-level playing field because it's hugely concentrated, right? So it's not just AI, but AI is probably the most extreme example where you can see that the reason why only large companies can do this is because they need to, first of all, they need scale, and because there's lots of failure going on. So if you're small as a country, or small as an industry, or small as a firm, you run much more risk for failure. But then secondly, you do need to do a massive amount of complementary investment in people, in organizational capital, and those kind of things. And most smaller companies cannot afford this.
Yeah.
So the question really is not so much about in competition policy is everything around the level playing field for everybody being access these resources. But the question is, do organizations have the ability to scale up these kind of technologies to the level that are needed in order to get those better results?
Yeah.
And I don't have the full answer, except that diffusion, this has major impacts on innovation and diffusion technologies, innovation and diffusion policy, sorry, about how do we support organizations. This is not so much about just giving them the access, it's about allowing them to create skill through platforms, through collaboration, through innovation ecosystems, and so on, so that they can be a competitive party towards the big players.
Yeah.
Because this new technology is never, in my view, never going to be a way of leveling the playing field. We will have to put in significant policies in order to allow smaller organizations, smaller places to actually build these complementary assets to get the results there. So I think competition policy needs to be rethought. I'm not an expert in that field, but I'm sure that Diane did talk a little bit about it because I know she's very engaged on that topic too.
Exactly. But also there's a discussion on the lack of competition on the labor market with these big firms. They don't have to pay the wages because they don't have, the workers don't have the possibility to change. So the big firms doesn't have to pay the high wages that they could. So we also have a discussion on the competition policy on the labor market.
Yes, and in fact, the UK Competition Authority has done a great report on labor market concentration, effects of new technologies that speaks to that topic.
Okay. And my last question is related to this bucket you left with labor market issues in the last part of your slides. You said something about minimum wages and productivity. And for me, the big story of the UK is the weak productivity growth over the last 15 to 20 years and the strong increase in the minimum wage during the same time. So what are there any connections here, or what are the effects of minimum wages on productivity?
Again, a big question. Well, we all know, I don't think we have to rehearse the literature on the impact of minimum wages on productivity, controlling for all other factors. And we know that there is a mixed effect here, that there probably is a bit of an inverse U curve on how far you push up these minimum wages, and beyond that, it probably doesn't have much effect on productivity. But it's all controlling for everything else that's going on.
Yeah.
And there's a lot else going on in the UK, also in other countries, but I know most about the UK. We've had 3 decades, as I said, of underinvestment. As a result, we created a lot of companies and places are in this sort of low value, low wage, low growth type of environment. But low wage is just part of the model that large parts of the UK economy have been working on. If you increase the minimum wage, it's one of those measures that are not going to have any effect, because you need a systemic change to lift these companies and places out of the trap they have fallen into, because I think that's a trap: low value, low wage, low productivity. Yeah. So just raising the wage and not anything else, I think is not going to have an effect. Okay. So I think what the current Labour government is trying to do is trying to pull levers that have been shown to work, but do not work in isolation. So my big comment, my big criticism of the current Labour government is that they're not joining up policies in the way they should. And it's not that they don't know that I should. I think they're politically paralyzed to do that. They were very badly prepared on how they're going to join up these policies.
Yeah.
And therefore they're pulling all sorts of levers that are sometimes very costly and don't really generate effects. Which is why I would be arguing in favor of productivity commissions, because these productivity commissions are not there just to give experts a job to do. I have a job, so I don't need it. But it is there because these experts can help you to understand trade-offs and complementarities and try to connect different parts of government and policies in order to make these things work. That's what's really important. So just putting some levers and do something big and then think you have an effect is not going to work if you're in a place with many low productivity traps.
Okay. But do you give a call to John van Rennen to say that he should be better?
Say it again.
Do you call John van Rennen to give him advice on his policies? Because I guess he's the advisor to Starmer now. Or...
Well, yeah, I mean, we talk to a lot of people in government, and I think again, it's not that people don't know how to do this.
Yeah.
It is because it's politically very hard. It goes back to my comment on pro-productivity policies. If you're at the frontier, it gets much more complex to make the next step and to have that kind of longer-term commitment.
Yes.
And you need to create a political capital. I'm not a politician, but you need to create a political capital. And the UK government has wasted a lot of political capital in the last 2 years, which is a big loss. And that may be why Starmer will not have a second term if he can even finish his first.
Yeah. Very, very good. We are running out of time, Bart. It's a very informative presentation and a nice discussion, I think.
Feel free to share the slides. If you make a PDF version of it, that's fine.
I send the slides to the registered. And we say thanks to you. Thanks a lot. And hopefully we keep in touch again.
You're very welcome and good to talk to you.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.
Thanks for listening.